All right. Hi, all. I think we're ready to get started. I want to thank you all for coming out this morning. I see a lot of excited faces of Georgetown Journal of Gender and the Law members. We're finally here. Thank you so much for coming. I also see a lot of faces of supporters in the room, and I appreciate your attending today. Our event is called Dismantling Reproductive Injustices, the Hyde Amendment and Criminalization of Self-Induced Abortion. This is the symposium event for Volume 18 of the Georgetown Journal of Gender and the Law. My name is Allison Tanner. I am co-editor-in-chief of Volume 18, along with Samantha Del Duca in the audience. And I would like to take this time right at the beginning to thank Allie Boehm and Courtney Lee, managing editors of the symposium edition, who put in more than 6 months of work planning this event today. Today is a very different day than I thought it was going to be. We're all thinking about the election that happened on Tuesday and what that means for the reproductive justice movement, as well as ourselves as individuals, as current lawyers, as future lawyers. I came to law school to become a reproductive justice lawyer, and I was excited to be working towards expanding rights. And this election has me feeling like I may have to continue the work to protect what we already have, which we know is not enough, as is the theme of today's event. So I just want to thank you all for coming here when I know that many of us didn't want to leave our beds today. So I really appreciate your time. And now I'm going to introduce Sabrina Andrus. She is the executive director of If, When, How, and If, When, How is the generous co-sponsor of this symposium event. So please give her a round of applause.
Good morning. As Allison mentioned, my name is Sabrina Andrus, and I'm the executive director of If, When, How, formerly Law Students for Reproductive Justice, for those of you who may not know. We are a national network of law students and legal professionals working to ensure that all people can decide if, when, and how to create and sustain their families. Because we know, like many of you, that reproductive justice doesn't just happen. It takes thoughtful action, it takes strategic activism, and we're really proud to stand beside all of you, our allies, and all the wonderful speakers today who are going to talk a little bit more about what that could actually look like. And our new tagline, Lawyering for Reproductive Justice, it's at the very, very bottom of that logo, helps explain the expanded role that we see and we envision for our organization, for our constituents, and for the movement as a whole. Moving forward, what we do now is encompass a broader network than just law students. After more than a decade of supporting students across the country to become stronger champions of reproductive justice on their own campuses, we've expanded our focus to engage law students and legal professionals once they graduate. Because we don't want to stop engaging with those folks when they do graduate and embark on their new legal career. And legal professionals really want help putting forth their passion and skills to work for reproductive justice. I'd say probably now more than ever. And we also know that together we'll have more collective power and expertise to lend the reproductive justice movement and to win, whatever those wins may look like. And there's more. We're not just expanding our network, we're expanding our charge. I'm really excited about this part. We're becoming more intentional about how we mobilize the legal community on behalf of reproductive justice, and we're working toward a critical transformation of the legal system itself, because as we know, the law is used so often as a tool for reproductive oppression and not reproductive justice, and we want to change that. In light of this new charge, we formally partnered with UC Berkeley's Center on Reproductive Rights and Justice to bring our resources to bear, our hundreds and hundreds of law students and lawyers and practitioners across the country, on 3 long-term strategic initiatives that concentrate primarily on public support for poor and low-income people's reproductive decisions and experiences. Together, we will overturn Harris v. McRae to restore the abortion right to a meaningful reality for all people, help repeal the welfare family cap, and halt the criminalization of self-induced abortion. because we believe firmly that for the right to terminate a pregnancy to be a reality for all, there must be a range of safe, effective, and affordable methods available to use for use in anyone's preferred setting. You'll be hearing about some of these issues today and more, and we are so thrilled to co-sponsor the event with the Georgetown Journal of Gender and the Law and the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health. Thank you for coming. Thank you for thinking critically and innovatively about how we can use the law as an effective tool for change. And the last thing I'll say is this. I'm going to echo what probably every nonprofit and social justice organization has emailed you in the last couple days. Not because I don't have anything original to say, but because it must be said over and over and over again, and this rally cry needs to be amplified as much as possible. We need each other, and we need to push this work forward now more than ever. I know many of us are grieving the outcome of the election, and grief is powerful. Grief is really powerful. So is sadness, anger, and righteousness. And coming together to fight for reproductive rights and justice, it is righteous. And I and everyone at If One How are really proud to do this work with you. Thanks.
All right, so we're going to get started with the first panel. If the international panelists could come up to the stage. Okay, great. I'll give this to you. Okay, so our first panel is on self-induced abortion internationally, and we have a group of really incredible activists and lawyers here to talk about it. Patty Schuster is our first panelist. She is the Senior Policy Advisor at IPAS, where she leads the organization's work to strengthen human rights in abortion law and policy. She's going to be discussing the failed promise of medical abortion in the international human rights framework. Patty also works to build capacity of lawyers, judges, and law enforcement officials on abortion and human rights. She promotes legal standards at United Nations human rights bodies and the African Commission on Human Rights and People's Rights, and leads IPAS's work to end abortion funding bans in U.S. foreign policy, which is going to be particularly important given the election on Tuesday. Prior to IPAS, she worked on reproductive health policy in the office of U.S. Senator Barbara Boxer. Patty also conducted fact-finding in Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, and Nepal on human rights and U.S. foreign policy for the Center for Reproductive Rights and Population Action International. She taught international human rights law at Drexel University Law School. Patty has a JD and MPP from the University of Michigan. So let's all welcome Patty.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So we are here, we're together, we're breathing, we're present. It's good to be together, I think. I really want to thank Courtney and Allison and Allie for bringing us all together for this symposium. Their work and our collective work is more important than ever, as you know. The challenges that we're going to face going in are going to be more difficult than we really can imagine right now. So it's good to be together and talk about how we are going to move forward to ensure that each and every woman can have access to abortion, which is the topic for today. So I work with IPAS in Spanish, IPAS in English. We're a global organization. Our focus is ensuring that each and every woman can have access to abortion care across the world. We focus on the world's poorest countries, and in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. We have staff in those countries, about 500 of us in total. And we work on training, service delivery, law and policy. I personally work on law and policy, and I work to help lawmakers and activists draft law and policy to ensure access to safe abortion, and that's where I come to this. And so I'm going to talk about the title of the talk, the title of the paper is How Laws Fail the Promise of Medical Abortion. And I'm happy for this to move outside of U.S. policy, outside the U.S. elections, to the world of the globe. And thank you for the Center for Reproductive Rights, who has this wonderful resource where we actually have a tremendous amount of progress in abortion care. So I'm happy to set aside the election for the next 15 minutes or so. So I'm going to basically make 4 points. The first point is that governments are liberalizing abortion laws around the world. That's where we're headed, mostly. Secondly, misoprostol, specifically, without a provider, is making abortion safer around the world. again, progress. But the third point I'm going to make is that those two trends are totally divorced from each other, and that the new laws basically ignore the fact of misoprostol and medical abortion. And fourth, I'll give some recommendations on the way forward. So first, and that's why this map is up here, is some global context on abortion. Over the past 20 years or so, the world has recognized that we need to make safe abortion legal. We need to make abortion safer and legal. And the movement to legalize abortion has roots, and some of you are familiar with this, in 1994 at the International Conference on Population and Development, where for the first time there was a huge number of women's rights activists in a conference on the topic of population and development. And because of that presence, we were able to talk about the need for governments to address unsafe abortion. Looking back, the need to address unsafe abortion has its limits, but at that time, it was the first time in a global conference that governments were talking about abortion. And we have 179 governments who signed on to that. And as much as I said we were going to leave the election, it was the Clinton administration. So you can imagine we're going to have a pause in that progress for now. But also we know, so that happened in a political forum, but also in the past 15 years or so, in the UN human rights arena, UN human rights authorities have talked about the need to address unsafe abortion and to make abortion more legal. So we see a tremendous amount of progress there too. We need to make abortion legal to save women's lives, but also protect their human rights to life, health, dignity, equality, autonomy, and other rights. There's tremendous progress at the UN level, and in places where IPAS works, that matters. Incidentally, too, international human rights law is preoccupied with the women who are most likely not to get safe abortion, not most likely to risk their health and life, unlikely to get any reproductive health services. And so these are the women that we're talking about. And since 1994 and continuing to this day, we've seen governments acting to liberalize laws. And so this is the CRR map. If you're not familiar with it, you should be. But what I've done is I've overlaid the countries that have changed their abortion law since 1994. And there are about 40 that have made it more liberal in one way or another. And there are different ways to categorize it. And it's a little, some people can say 30, some people can say 40, depending on how you categorize it. But we like to say 40. And we only have a handful, 2, 3, or 4, depending on how you're counting, who've gone backward. So we see progress in the past 20 years. And what has happened and what this reflects are some added reasons that abortion is legal. So, for example, I'll give you 3 countries that only allowed abortion when a woman's life was threatened before. Nepal changed its law in 2002. And that was a part of a package of reforms to protect women's rights, things like inheritance rights and marriage rights, and also abortion rights. Ethiopia in 2005 made abortion legal for rape and health reasons, and also social reasons for young women as part of the reform of the criminal law. And just to go back, Nepal, early abortion is legal for any reason whatsoever. In 2012, Rwanda changed its law, and Rwanda's a teeny little country up there by Lake Victoria, to allow abortion for rape and health reasons. So this is some of the progress that we're talking about. We've added reasons for legal abortion. There's a trend toward adding reasons. But as you know, as Americans, I know the majority, at least in this auditorium, are Americans. We know that it's not the reasons that are the issue. The devil is really in the barriers, and that's something that we're really familiar with here in the US. And it's also a problem elsewhere as well. The barriers are the problem in Rwanda. So for example, I'll give an example from Rwanda. IPAS went to Rwanda. We had some researchers interview a woman in detention, and she was in detention in 2013. This was a year after we celebrated the change in the abortion law in Rwanda. So abortion is legal in Rwanda, hooray. However, we did happen to find a woman named Sylvie who was in detention. She's a 20-year-old secondary school student. And one evening when she was leaving school, she was late to meet her brother. So she took a motorcycle taxi, which is the way people get around when they're not walking a lot of times in Rwanda. In the middle of the ride, the driver demanded that she have sex with him, and when she said no, he raped her. And she didn't tell anybody about the rape, and we have a quote from her that says, "I just want to die." So after finding out that she was pregnant, she took some pills that she thought would help end the pregnancy. And when she started bleeding, neighbors came to help, but when they came to help, they also called the police. The police first took her to a hospital and then took her to jail. And when we interviewed her, she was on pretrial detention for 30 days. She had no lawyer, no hearing date, and she had missed her national exam to go to senior high school, and that was her biggest concern. So I'm going to use that story to pivot to my next point. As I said, after finding out that she was pregnant, Sylvie took pills. And as you can imagine, and why we're here today, is that Sylvie isn't the only woman in the world who found out she was pregnant, wanted to end the pregnancy, and took pills. In fact, medical abortion is completely changing the landscape of abortion care, and that's my second point. And I'm going to focus on a specific drug here. The drug is misoprostol. Misoprostol I'm focusing on because it's cheap and it's available. We also know that you can end unwanted pregnancy with mifepristone and misoprostol, but right now, for the purpose of this, I'm just talking about misoprostol. Misoprostol is a drug for ulcers. It's a drug that at some point, some women, and we think in Latin America, looked at the contraindication, looked at a bottle for abortion that said may cause miscarriage. And for a woman with unwanted pregnancy, that's good news. And so misoprostol is effective for ending unwanted pregnancy, and women are starting to use it. To what extent is misoprostol changing the landscape globally for abortion care? In fact, we don't really know for sure, because women are ending their pregnancy illegally, in secret, and they're doing it without having complications. So ordinarily when we measure illegal abortion or unsafe abortion, we count the women who come to hospital and then do some modeling and figure that out. But with misoprostol, we can't do that because a lot of the women who are taking misoprostol never interact with an institution where we can count them. So you can imagine there are clear challenges for public health research. And I want to just pause here and kind of step aside to talk about terminology. What I'm going to talk about is abortion without a provider. And I know that the theme of this conference is women's self-use. And the reason why I'm not using women's self-use is because a lot of times women will rely on a pharmacist or a friend or an auntie or a mother or somebody or a sister to help them, and they're not doing it alone. And for the purposes of the law, we're really looking at women who take misoprostol without the provider who is authorized to help her. So we don't know a lot, but there are a few things that we do know, and I'm going to name 5 of them. 1, we know that women die from unsafe abortion when they use dangerous methods to end an unwanted pregnancy. And in the past, we used to talk about unsafe abortion, and the methods that we've documented are things like sticks, chemicals, bleach, jumping, blunt trauma, jumping from dangerous heights, using roots. Those are some of the kinds of ways that women end unwanted pregnancy. But we also know that the drug misoprostol is accessible to women in many places where an abortion provider is not. We know that misoprostol is available. There are chemical sellers in some African countries, specifically Nigeria, that go door to door with drugs because there's no pharmacy. They have misoprostol. And it's cheap. It's relatively cheap. And we also know that many poor women who, even where abortion is legal, can't get to an abortion provider, but they can get to misoprostol. We also know that women have safely used misoprostol without a provider to end a pregnancy. We know that has happened, we know that can happen, and the effectiveness rate is between 75% and 85% for misoprostol alone, meaning that she would need follow-up care in the 25 to 15%. We also know that health professionals and women's rights activists all over the world are promoting information about how to do an abortion with misoprostol and also promoting the access to the drug itself. So we actually know of organizations, Women on Web, we have hotlines that we support, they're hotlines that probably will be talked about. We know that this is happening. And lastly, we know that global estimates of unsafe abortion that are aggregated by the World Health Organization, so when the World Health Organization counts all the unsafe abortions in the world, we know it's going down. We can't say exactly why, but we do have studies from certain countries that point to availability of misoprostol is causing unsafe abortion to go down. So what we are going to do is assume that's true all over the world, that misoprostol is making illegal abortion safer all over the world. Like I said, abortion with pills really changed the landscape. And in fact, the World Health Organization agrees. In the past, World Health Organization used to say, abortion is either safe or unsafe. Safe abortion is with a trained provider, with skill, and in a facility. Every other abortion is unsafe, and that was it. But then in 2014, WHO for the first time said, well, maybe that dichotomy isn't right. In fact, they said we can't dichotomize abortion at all anymore. Because of the advent of medical abortion, we don't have safe and unsafe abortion anymore. And WHO is huge, and they need tremendous amount of evidence to take a position. So they're saying we can't dichotomize it anymore because of medical abortion, and we're looking into it. It hasn't led to recommendations yet. So to recap, we have two promising trends. Abortion is becoming more legal, and more women are ending their pregnancies with pills and without a provider, and that means that medical abortion has had this great promise to save women's lives. But now I'm going to make my third point, which is really the thesis, which is the laws are totally failing to live up to the promise of medical abortion. And how is this so? Well, it's because the involvement of a health provider, and these are usually medical doctors, and they're sometimes nurses and midwives, the involvement of a health provider is part of nearly every abortion law in the world. Required involvement of a health provider for abortion is the norm. We know that laws change much more slowly than medical technology, and really abortion laws reflect surgical abortion and not medical abortion. Just to give some examples. So I analyzed these 40 countries that have changed since 1994. 27 of them require authorization by a medical doctor. We happen to know, and WHO recommends, that nurses, midwives, even paramedical professionals, sort of low-level medical professionals, can do abortion safely. But 27 of these purple laws require a medical doctor to provide the abortion. And some of them require more than one medical doctor to be involved in the abortion decision. And we also know that 14 of these 40 laws, early abortion was legalized for any reason. That means that you don't need to state a reason, you can just have an early abortion. 10 of these require authorization by a health professional. So we see that the movement to liberalize laws is really hindered by these provider requirements. Part of the problem is British legal tradition. 60 countries in the world used to be colonies of Great Britain. Some of these countries haven't changed their laws at all. A lot of the red countries in Africa in particular haven't changed their abortion laws, and so their abortion laws date back to 1861, the Offenses Against the Person Act, which basically prohibits all abortion except if there's a life endangerment issue. And even for countries that have changed their laws, a lot of those countries will look to the current British law of 1967 for guidance. And British laws, old and new, basically have the same kind of pattern of language. There's basically a general prohibition on abortion. Abortion is legal, there are penalties, it's criminal, but abortion may be legal, but it's conditioned on the involvement of a healthcare professional. So for example, this is the language, that a person shall not be guilty of an offense under the abortion law when pregnancy is terminated by a registered medical practitioner. And in the case of Great Britain and a lot of the laws that followed, it has to have the one medical practitioner, which is a doctor, and then 2 other doctors to sign off on it. So we're talking about 3 doctors to sign off on an abortion. Which works, I guess it works okay in Great Britain, which I'm not an expert on, but I know it doesn't work in a lot of places in the global south. Not only is this unnecessary to have so many medical doctors involved, it's also utterly unworkable for the majority of women in the global south who are rural and poor. I'll give an example of Zambia, which is one of the orange countries, and Zambia actually changed its law a long time ago in 1972. And it completely mirrors British law. it requires the involvement of 3 medical practitioners. So in Zambia, to have a legal abortion, and there's social reasons, you can have a legal abortion because you can't afford to raise a kid, for example. And so you need the medical doctor who provides, and then you need 2 more to approve it. And that means there's no legal abortion for most women in Zambia. In Zambia, there are fewer than 2 physicians for every 10,000 women, or 10,000 people, 2 physicians for every 10,000 people, and they need 3 of them to get a legal abortion. And we know that in Zambia, complications from unsafe abortion still contribute 30% of maternal deaths in Zambia, even though abortion is legal. And going back to Rwanda, the law of Rwanda, in fact, specifically criminalizes women who procure their own abortion. So we know that most national laws are no good in the area of medical abortion, but we also know that global standards are no good in the area of medical abortion. Human rights authorities talk about the need to decriminalize abortion for additional reasons, which is great, but they fail to address the specific barriers in the law that prevents women from actually being able to get abortion. No human rights authorities have recognized the need to get rid of provider requirements in order to ensure women's human rights. And the human rights authorities I'm talking about are basically the treaty monitoring committees that oversee the CEDAW Convention, the Women's Convention, the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, Economic and Social Rights, the rights of the child, and also the special rapporteurs who are affiliated with them. Another standard setter in my field is the World Health Organization, and the World Health Organization publishes guidance on how to write abortion law and policy. The last one they did was in 2012. So if you remember, the statement that they said is maybe the dichotomy doesn't work was in 2014. So in 2012, they have this guidance, and it talks about the only safe abortions. It recommends that there must be a health provider in order to have a safe abortion. And so this is what countries are looking to when they're drafting abortion laws. So this is significant when a Ministry of Health official or a legislator is trying to figure out how to draft an abortion law. They're looking at old laws, they're looking at laws that follow their legal tradition, they're looking at WHO, and they're also looking at international human rights in countries outside the US. And right now, all of the guidance says you must have a provider to have a safe and legal abortion. So you can see that the laws are behind. And it's a huge problem because abortion laws can last decades, even centuries. We're still dealing with all those African red laws. A lot of them are the law of 1861. And misoprostol is, if you're talking centuries, is relatively new. Who knows what the future is going to hold for abortion care? So there could be even simpler and cheaper methods in the future, and then you'll still be dealing with these laws that say you need a medical doctor, 2 medical doctors, even a nurse or midwife, which won't be necessary. So what is the way forward? We need to work towards standards. We need to get the law to catch up to save women's lives and actually uphold women's rights, to support women's use of medical abortion without a provider. But how do we do this? Well, at the government level, we're always advising governments, ministries of health, and activists in the Global South and legislators that we need to get rid of provider requirements in the abortion law. What we tend to say is that regulatory documents can deal with that. Just leave providers out of the abortion law. If you have to include a provider, put it in the standards and guidelines, put it in the regulatory documents by the Ministry of Health, because those can be changed much more easily. So far, governments aren't buying it because they're like, what about the WHO? We don't see any human rights law on this, and all the other laws have a provider requirement. Why shouldn't we? So it's a real uphill battle. So the WHO is a problem because we don't have sufficient evidence to show that women can end pregnancies safely without a provider. The evidence, we don't have enough evidence because of all those challenges I talked about that the WHO can recommend it. So we need rigorous research studies to document that, and that's possible. And my research friends at IPAS can, and if we have other public health researchers in the room, there are ways to do it. It's hard and it's expensive, but we must do that to build the evidence. And lastly, we need to educate the human rights authorities because they want to decriminalize abortion. They just don't know, basically, that these provider requirements are a problem in the era of medical abortion. And we need to get some good recommendations. So we're in a place right now where abortion technology has radically outpaced laws from a global perspective, radically outpaced international standards, and we need to work to catch up if we're really going to harvest the health and human rights potential of medical abortion across the globe. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Patty. So we're going to have 15 minutes at the end of the panel to have audience questions, so just hold your thoughts on each of the speakers' remarks until then. So next up, we have Elida Caballero Cabrera. Elida is an advocacy advisor for Latin America and the Caribbean at the Center for Reproductive Rights. She's going to be discussing pregnancy prosecutions in the international context with a focus on Latin America and the Caribbean. Elida joined the center in 2016. She works on advancing and seeking increased recognition of reproductive rights across Latin America and the Caribbean through the implementation of advocacy strategies before the Organization of American States, OAS, and in other intergovernmental processes. She's also responsible for the center's advocacy work in El Salvador and Honduras. Elida was a consultant at the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency and the World Bank Group, and also worked in the health department of the Latin America and the Caribbean and South Asia regions. Prior to that, Elida worked as a legal counselor at the Mission of Panama to the OAS, a consular officer at the Embassy of Panama to the White House, and a program assistant at the Academy on Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at the American University Washington College of Law. Elida received her law degree at the Universidad Santa Maria la Antigua in Chiriquí, Panama, and her LLM at the American University Washington College of Law in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Elida. You can use either the clicker or the...
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. Good morning. And thank you so much to the Georgetown Journal of Gender and the Law for the invitation. As everyone has said before, we're a little bit sad today. It's not the way we wanted to have this amazing symposium, but we're going to be okay. We're going to be strong together, and we're going to keep working on these amazing issues that are so important. As a Latina woman, an immigrant in this country, where I have found amazing and wonderful welcoming from everyone, and where I found my passion for human rights and now for women's rights. And this is such another bump on the road that we will get through it. So thank you so much for organizing this. As many of you know, sorry, I don't know. Perfect. The topic that I'm going to be speaking about, since I work with Latin America and the Caribbean, it's more focused internationally. And I know the title is about self-induced abortions, but we have different issues that we're working in Latin America. We have obstetric emergencies, persecutions, we have abortion persecutions, so I'm just gonna mix a little bit and talk about that for you. The Center for Reproductive Rights, it's an international organization, and what we do is we use law to advance reproductive freedom, reproductive rights. And these combined with our political advocacy around the world, it's what we use to do this. We work in around 70 countries around the world. We have offices in Geneva, Asia. Our office in Latin America is in Bogota, New York, and Washington, D.C. I'm going to divide the presentation in these couple topics. It's going to be what are pregnancy persecutions used from our side, what rights are being violated, and some studies that I took from my colleagues in Africa, and specifically then I'm going to focus on speaking about Latin America. What we found pregnancy prosecutors, what do we understand about them? For decades, we have been seeing that all law enforcement personnel, judges, and people in general, especially fundamentalists and rights movements, have sought to punish women for how they act during their pregnancy. It is very unreasonable to think that a woman has to focus her whole life on how and all the things that she will be doing while pregnant. And it's also terrible that some proponents want to gain legal recognitions to fetal rights, and these premises just has separate interests or equal or greater rights to the fetus instead of the woman. Definitely, we have seen some of these trends in Latin America, and what we have found in some of the cases that we have seen, especially, for example, Artavia Murillo, that actually says that the fetus rights cannot be overcome women's rights, and they have to be incremental and gradually during the pregnancy. So these things that we have seen, for example, right now there is a law reform trying to be passed in the penal code in Honduras, and they want to introduce one of these articles for legal fetuses' rights that completely undermine the interests of the woman. So we're trying to work on these issues in the region. Some of these advocates of fetal rights have argued that the children should be able to even sue their mothers. And this is something that they call prenatal injuries. And we definitely have to look at the big picture and see that we as women's advocates, we also advocate and agree that the women should engage in behaviors that promote a healthy birth. But these rights should definitely be not be more important as from the women. In this presentation, I'm definitely going to talk about some cases of abortions, post-abortion care, and obstetric emergency. And I'm not going to talk the topic about pregnancy or delivery for women with substance abuse issues, because I think it's a very taboo topic, and we don't have experience on that. But we will move forward with the other topics. What rights are being violating with all these new trends that we're seeing? Rights of life, rights of health, rights of freedom and security, decide the number of children and the space in between the children that you want to have, equality and non-discrimination, privacy, freedom from cruel and degrading treatment, freedom from gender-based and sexual violence, access to information, and other. All these rights are affirmed in different human rights instruments. Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women, Convention of Belém do Pará, American Convention of Human Rights, CEDAW Convention, Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And these human rights search already are confirmed that are essential for the basic enjoyment of fundamental rights from everyone. And they cannot be protected without guaranteeing the right of women and adolescents to control their own sexuality, the access to information, and basic services on reproductive health. The first case that I'm going to talk about, there are two cases in Africa that my colleagues from our office in Kenya were nice enough to share with me. There's one case on abortion and one case on post-abortion care, but one of the cases is, as we believe, we're sure it was a self-induced abortion, but the other one we are not sure yet. The first case, it will be Nasuna Millie case in Uganda. Nasuna was an orphan living in Uganda. She was living in very vulnerable conditions, and she was living with an old woman that was taking care of her. She, of course, found a relationship, found a boyfriend, had sexual relations, and then became pregnant. Of course, the father of the man left her as soon as he knew she was pregnant, and she went to one of these herbs centers in Uganda and requested some herbs to lose, to be able to lose the baby, in the pregnancy, because she doesn't have anything to provide to this pregnancy. She doesn't have a job. She lives in very vulnerable conditions. So she takes the herbs and had an abortion. The community finds out. The community sees her, looks for her. After beating her in public, called the police, and sent them to jail. She was in jail about 7 months before even got a first hearing of her case. And while in jail, one of the women that was taking care of all the women in jail told her, "We have so many cases like yours, and I can tell you that if you plead guilty when you get your hearing, you won't get the 8 years that the law sets for abortion. They will give you less." And that's what she did. She pleaded guilty on her hearing after 7 months of being in jail. She was sentenced to 7 more months. And at the end, she ended it leaving jail after 5 months and being there for good behavior and stuff. While in prison waiting for trial, she never had a lawyer. She never had anyone hearing her case. And she was absolutely scared. Till this day, the herbs that she took still have had an impact on her health. When we found the story a couple of years ago, she was still feeling pain, sometimes bleeding from the herbs that no one knows what it was. So this is a case where we really need to, well, we understand in this room, but we really need to visualize these issues, because always, and it's one of the other topics that I want to point out, is that the women that are more persecuted and take these extreme measures are the women that are in more vulnerable conditions in life. The next case is a case of Jackson Talley in Kenya. This is a case of a provider, and it's a case that it's still going on in Kenya. Mr. Talley was a registered nurse that has his small clinic in Kenya. And then one day, one woman comes to the clinic bleeding and in a lot of pain. When he saw that she was bleeding and in a lot of pain and started checking her, he decided that he wasn't sure what she had, and he was going to take her to a hospital because he was just running a very small clinic. When he took her to the hospital, on the way to the hospital, she died in his car. So when everyone found out, he was appointed and sent to jail as part of being the person, since she died in his custody, the person that was guilty of her death. He's been in prison since 2009 when this happened until today. He hasn't had a trial yet, and he's still in jail waiting for. Actually, he had a trial and he was sentenced to death. And we are working in his case to try to get something out of this terrible situation, because we have a lot of proofs that says that the woman came into his clinic already bleeding, consequences of a botched abortion, and there is no proof, and there was no proof in trial that says that he was the one who provided the abortion. So these two cases just show how, without any elements, women and providers are being definitely accused for providing or helping or having an abortion. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about El Salvador, which is actually where we're working a little bit more. In Latin America, we're working right now specifically in several countries that are changing and reforming their penal codes to give access to abortion, at least in the 3 international exceptions. And El Salvador, which is one of the countries that have the more draconian abortion laws in the world. Women are prosecuted for even having obstetric emergencies, and they are sent to jail, and then they're convicted for homicide and sentenced to up to 40 years. In the last couple months, the very conservative political parties of El Salvador introduced a law reform project that wanted to equalize abortion to homicide. So not only that they already been prosecuted for having an obstetric emergency and they're sentenced to 40 years because of homicide, they want to have abortion to get a sentence up to 40 years. So in case that a woman comes with an abortion that they cannot prove that she just had an obstetric emergency, she can also be sentenced to 40 years. Luckily, we have some great champions in El Salvador that are helping. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but I just wanted to show you these charts of what are the effects of El Salvador total criminalization of abortion. This chart, it's terrible. I mean, the age of the women prosecuted, if you can see, the 56%, there are women from 21 to 25 years old. 88 were between the ages of 18 and 25. I mean, in other words, young women and adolescents are the ones that are suffering the most with this draconian law. In these charts, for example, the marital status of the women prosecuted has been single. So again, we're going to these vulnerable groups of poor women, uneducated, single, in very marginal areas of El Salvador, who are the ones that have been criminalized. There is a big story, and I'm pretty sure everyone who's been involved in reproductive rights have heard about La 17 in El Salvador. And the story of La 17, it's a very dramatic story that we at the center have been working and following very hard, very closely. Under these extreme abortion bans, we had found that when we found the case a couple years ago, there were only 17. Today, the number is growing up to like probably 40. So we call it the 17 and more. And these are women that have been wrongfully criminalized and imprisoned for having obstetric emergencies, and they have been sentenced to homicide. Since 1998, dozens of women have been wrongfully criminalized and imprisoned under this law, even when the pregnancy ended due to natural causes. They come from small coastal villages, rural farms, and small parts of the crowded cities. Teenagers, uneducated women, wives, and mothers. The case of La 17 has brought a lot of international attention because when we found the cases a couple years ago, the center went to jail and started interviewing them. And when we start hearing their stories saying that, you know, I was just working and then I started bleeding and then I was taken to the hospital. And when I was in the hospital, the doctor decided and assumed that I had an abortion because I'm a single mother, and they called the police. So these women that we have found, and I actually going to talk about the three most big stories of the three women that are part of La 17, are really, really touching. So the first case that I'm going to tell you about a little bit is the case of Manuela. Manuela was a 33-year-old Salvadorian mother of two who was accused of having an abortion by the medical professional treating her for severe complications she suffered while giving birth. Manuela lacked the financial resources to hire a private lawyer and only met her public defenders on the day of the hearing and was charged with murder and sentenced to 30 years. While in prison, she was diagnosed with advanced Hodgkin's lymphoma, which most likely was the cause of the miscarriage. And since she did not receive the adequate treatment, she died in jail 1 year after her miscarriage. Manuela could have been the first one of La 17. Manuela did not make it for us to meet her because she died. And after, if you read this short paragraph of her story, what we realize and we discover is that her Hodgkin's lymphoma was the one who caused the obstetric emergency that led her to have a miscarriage and then sent her to jail. And on top of that, she was in jail and she did not receive the adequate treatment that she needed, and then she died. We have the case of Manuela. We present a petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights against El Salvador for the case of Manuela. It's still in the process of within the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. But it's a really big case for us because it not only shows that there are no rights for these women, but also the conditions of jail in El Salvador, as everywhere else, but specifically in El Salvador, are pretty extreme and bad. Guadalupe. Guadalupe was working as a housekeeper when the complications with her pregnancy led to a miscarriage. She was rushed to the hospital where she says the doctors took one look at her and called the police. She was arrested, tried even, and sentenced to 30 years in jail. After both the Human Rights Congressional Committee and the Supreme Court Committee submitted recommendations for her case, she was pardoned and released in 2015. Guadalupe was pardoned when she only had 2 months left of her sentence. Guadalupe is out today, and when you hear her story, and I completely invite you guys to go to our website where we have a lot of videos of all these stories and fact sheets with more information. And when you hear her story, it's terrible. She said, I was working, I had pain, my boss didn't let me go to the hospital. I had to stay there until she came. She didn't pay me, so I have to ask for a friend to drive me to the hospital. And then while I was in the hospital, no one even asked me anything. They just assumed, they just called the police, the doctors called the police, and they sent me over. The problem in this, and I don't wanna showcase the providers as the evils here, but the law is so extreme and terrible that it requires that every doctor that has a suspicion that a woman has had an abortion has to call the police. If not, they're also going to be trial and criminalized and probably sentenced to something in jail, some time in jail. So every time a woman comes to a hospital, everyone assumes that this is an abortion, that it was a self-induced abortion, because of course they do not go anywhere. I mean, the other cases they have seen are self-induced abortions with pills, with farm pills that are used to kill some of the bacteria that grows in the farms, and some of these women have died. So it's very extreme. So it's very difficult for them to decide it's my life or hers in jail. So, but it's a very difficult situation. And the last case is Maria Teresa. Maria, who I have the pleasure to meet, and she's amazing. Maria Teresa also, she didn't even know she was pregnant. And she went into labor, experienced heavy bleeding, and giving birth in a public restroom. When you ask Maria Teresa and she tells you, I felt in pain and I just needed to go to the bathroom, and then I felt something. This is a woman that lives in one of the most extreme and dangerous parts of El Salvador. She was working in one of the maquilas, which are the factories that they have outside El Salvador, getting paid, I think, $3 a day. She already have a child. She leave. Her husband she used to, and she wasn't single. Her husband was an alcoholic who mistreated her. Like all the regular stories and conditions where these women are very vulnerable. And and she tells you. And then I went to the hospital, and when I was on the bed, they just chained me to the bed, and they just told me, I'm going to jail because I killed my son. And she started crying. All these women are so religious that when you ask them, no, I did not commit an abortion. That's a sin. It just happened, and they felt so guilty, and their lives just become even worse because when they arrive to jail, everyone just point at them as killers of their babies. So these are really bad situations. And Maria Teresa today, despite inconsistency, after being condemned to 40 years. This year, we, in collaboration with our national lawyers, we submitted a revision of her case. We sent some amicus briefs, and due to inconsistencies on her trial, that there were no proof that she actually committed an abortion, she was released. The prosecution appeal, and just last week we had the final confirmation of her release, and she's now in her house with her family. So these are cases that just show how extreme this ban is and how terrible the laws in El Salvador are. Currently, as I said before, we have this very terrible and extreme project reform introduced by the fundamentalists. Well, one of our women's rights champions, one of the legislators in El Salvador, just introduced also another reform to the penal code with 4 exceptions to be allowed in El Salvador for abortion. What the process right now is that this reform is in a commission that is going to review the reform, request information, and then they will decide if the reform is going to pass to Congress to be discussed by all the Congress members. The very importance of this is that if we at least can lift the ban of this on these 4 exceptions, all these women are going to be able to be protected. This is a very big issue. It just increased the numbers of maternal mortality. Women are doing all these extreme situations to end their pregnancies, and this just takes me back to another really sad case that happened in Peru. Her name was LC. LC was 17. She was raped, and when she found out she was pregnant, she jumped from a 5th floor, and she didn't die. She was rushed to the hospital, and she was diagnosed with paraplegia. And when they discovered, then she needed to get surgery in order to increase her ability to be able to probably move a little bit more. And when the doctors find out she was pregnant, they decided not to intervene her because it was going to cause a loss on the pregnancy. So 3 months after, of course, she had to be rushed to the hospital again. They have to do a C-section because, it was natural miscarriage for all her situation. And when they decided to do the surgery, it was not useful anymore. And she's today is in a bed without being able to move any single part of her body. We're also having this case in one of the monitor treaties of human rights, but it's just more and more situations of vulnerability of women around the world that are just suffering from all these terrible laws that are happening that all these countries have. The problem with Central America and the continent in general is that it's a very conservative, religious continent, and these fundamentalist organizations are just running around. And we can see what happened, for example, all the marches that have been going around against all the human rights movements, call it LGBT movement, women's rights movement, and everything. It's just very, very dangerous to see how they are becoming part of the lawmakers and policymakers. Currently, besides Honduras and El Salvador, they are reforming their laws. Also, Peru, Chile, to actually have complete access. And the thing that I forgot to mention about the case of LC is that therapeutic abortion was legal by the time she tried to commit suicide. But since they didn't have the protocols and they didn't know how to apply this law, they didn't do it, and because also she was gonna lose the pregnancy. And as my colleague from IPA said before, it's not only the fact that we have to work on good policies and in order to change these laws, it's also working on all the regulations and regulations and the protocols that have to be implemented after. Because in a lot of places we have the laws, but it's really hard to be able to implement them. So a little bit of the total criminalization of abortion, and it relates a lot with the violence that it's happening. This total criminalization of abortion entrenches cultural patterns of stigma and discrimination for women, creates barriers for women to access basic health services, create barriers for women to access the justice system, and disproportionately affects a specific group of women, creating multiple layers of discrimination. All this is definitely institutional violence, and it completely it's a systematic violation on human rights. Last, I want to give you some of my final points that after this week I thought about very carefully, and I wanted to share with you on this issue. Definitely, to maximize the full potential of all the girls and adolescents around the world, it's essential that our global community invest in their health and sexual and reproductive rights together. More than 3.2 million of girls and adolescents in developing countries put their lives in danger going through unsafe and illegal abortion for lack of access to it. The systematic violations to the reproductive rights, especially the total ban on abortion, not only goes against human rights, but it's also violence against women. And this is just because it perpetuates cultural patterns of stigma and discrimination, creates barriers to access health services for women, and create barriers to access to justice, as I just said. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elida. Our third panelist is Andrea Parra. She is a practitioner in residence at the Immigrant Justice Clinic of the Washington College of Law at American University. Andrea will be discussing how the Zika crisis has brought about issues regarding the intersection between abortion rights and disability rights, and how those tensions manifest within a human rights framework. Andrea Parra is an attorney, legal activist, and experiential trainer. She holds a law degree from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, and an LLM in American law from Boston University. Between 2011 and 2016, she was the director of the Action Program for Equality and Social Inclusion, which is PAIS in Spanish, a human rights law clinic at the Universidad de los Andes that engages in legal and political advocacy against discrimination based on disability, gender identity, and sexual orientation. Prior to joining PAIS, she worked as a senior staff attorney at Women's Link Worldwide, where she directed the Gender Justice Observatory and worked on projects related to migrant women and implementation of international human rights standards. Since 2014, she has been a training associate with Training for Change, an organization that has developed an experiential methodology that helps groups stand up more effectively for justice, peace, and environment. Andrea is a member of the board of directors of the organizations Women Enabled International, Colombia Diversa, and Sinergias. Thanks. Yeah, it should work. Let me do this. And you can just point it at the screen.
Podiums are usually taller than I am. So. I'd rather stand on the side. Thank you for the invitation. And it's a pleasure for me to be here. And I think that in this week, I've found myself seeking community more intentionally. So this is one of the communities that I feel I belong to and have belonged to for several years. I want to talk about this intersection of abortion rights and disability rights. Which can be a dicey conversation, and that before Zika, I chose to only have it in very small circles, guaranteed feminist circles, because it's an intersection that creates a lot of appropriation from the religious right to advance restriction of abortion rights. So there's always some caution for me in terms of how we bring this about. And even though I consider it precisely because that disability is used as a tactic, a feminist conversation on this intersection is very needed. And I also want to say that the intersection between disability rights and reproductive justice is broader than abortion. And some of the issues that we've been working on are forced sterilization, forced contraception in mental health institutions, menstrual control of women with disabilities, prohibitions to marry, sexual violence completely unreported, guardianship laws that prevent women to engage in sexual consent. So there's a whole range of issues that impact women with disabilities at the intersection of reproductive justice. And it is important to know that there's still a dire need for feminist conversations about this intersection. There are not many people talking about it. So what happened with Zika is that some of these tensions that have existed and some of these fault lines in these two movements and two causes were highlighted. So this is not something that just happened with Zika, but Zika made us kind of bring this about. So I want to talk about specifically on abortion, how the intersections happen. So on the one hand, we can talk about two specific situations. One is when the woman who has an unwanted pregnancy is a woman with a disability. So in that situation, we talk about how do organizations and service providers actually register that she has a disability, and that has a whole lot of complications. Many times, they only report visible disabilities. Then there's another question of accessibility to sexual and reproductive healthcare services. That goes from availability to interpretation, to physical accessibility of equipment, to language, to format of information materials, websites, all sorts of things, so the whole issue of accessibility. Then what is informed consent? And this is situations, for example, I met a woman who has a psychosocial disability, she has a psychiatric diagnosis, and then she finds doctors telling her, you can't be a mother. Like, how can you even think about being pregnant? Or if they have a wanted pregnancy, right? So these kinds of stereotypes in consent and information are very common. The other thing is that virtually all countries in the world have guardianship laws that restrict legal capacity to consent. And this is at least for continental law countries, like all of Latin America and Europe, this is directly inherited from Roman law, and virtually has not been changed since the Romans. Just the words, but the structure of the institution remains the same. You assign full authority to a third party to make all decisions to protect the person who cannot decide. So that's a legal institution that was created with the impulse to protect people who were, it was called mente capti, so people who can't think, or loci furiosi, which is where it comes, like the furious, crazy person comes from. And it had a patrimonial impulse. But over time, and with the development of law, it expanded to all sorts of decisions, including health, sexuality, marriage, etc. So that's a huge legal barrier to the exercise of reproductive rights. Guardianship laws are also very linked to how people can access justice. So who takes complaints and who can testify, and credibility of people with disabilities is also very diminished. And then the other situation on abortion where we see this intersection happening is when there is a prenatal diagnosis that identifies a specific impairment, and many laws call it malformation. So, and in that situation, we're talking about how the diagnosis is conveyed to women. So many women that, and I'll say a bit more about each of these, but many women who have children with disabilities have told me, I remember even the color of the tie that the doctor had, that they told me that I was gonna have a baby with Down syndrome or with a disability. And they told me like they were giving me condolences. No? Like, you're now subject to this tragedy. I'm so sorry for you. This is what's gonna happen. Brace yourself, no, for what's coming. So that kind of language is very pervasive in the way medical discourse happens. Then there's the whole discussion about prenatal testing and what's the reasoning behind it and why is it done and what justifies it. In general, even also with Zika, it doesn't have a specific, strictly therapeutic goal. It doesn't create any change in some cases, or in the cases where there's a diagnosis or Zika, or there's no intervention that can be done at that point of the diagnosis to improve the health of either, or the situation of the fetus or the pregnant woman. It's basically to decide whether the person will have an abortion. So the reasoning behind the prenatal testing has been also the topic of several debates. And then there's the whole other issue of mental health, of the mental health ground for abortion, which is when it's laid out in most of the laws and in Latin America, in many countries, as when the pregnancy poses a risk to the health, physical or mental, of the pregnant woman. And that's another area where this intersection gets highlighted and this tension gets highlighted. And then liability for denial of abortion services when the child who's born has a disability. So that's another way in which this intersection shows some of these tensions between the two movements. So I'm also using the Center for Reproductive Rights world map on abortion laws. And I'm not talking about the complete ban on abortion in those countries, because then that's not really where the intersection comes, because all abortions are banned. And also not about where places where it's completely liberalized. So when you cannot use any ground to have an abortion and there's no time limit, then that's also out of kind of where these tensions are the most highlighted. But this is the list of countries that the CDC has received reports with Zika cases. And the two grounds for abortion that are where these tensions come to light are fetal impairment and health, whether it's mental health, and also with fetal impairment in some countries, the requirement is also on viability. And like Patty said, in all of these, the certification of a provider is required for this ground to be applied. So I want to do a little exercise now. And I'm going to show you these headlines. And I'm going to ask you in the next 3 minutes if you can talk to a person close to you. If you're alone, just move closer to someone. And choose a few, and talk about what representation of disability do these headlines have. Like, what do they say about disability? So 3 minutes. And if you can't see one, I'm happy to read it. Maybe a little hard.
Work with Aram, so I do U.S. foreign policy, but I didn't know that any global staff was here too.
Only me.
Okay. Is it because of family situation or?
No, because I was already here. I've been here for 10 years.
Oh, you work with the Inter-American, the AU, and got it.
Yeah, I was at the OAS before. But since we're going to be doing work with OAS and other international organizations here, that's here.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Do you know my colleagues Jillian and?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I know Jillian and Bia Gali.
They just came here recently for a little OAS within the past 6 months to sort of figure out what to do. But this was before all the defunding happened.
Yeah. And I've been at the center for 5 months.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
This was probably actually right before you came. They were here trying to figure out sort of an OAS.
Yeah,
strategy.
but we have been in some meetings together about the next General Assembly and the OAS. And he has been very active on all the international organizations meetings. So.
I mean, I think you know our Marta Ma and our, I don't know if you know.
Marta Mariano, I haven't met her, but I heard a lot about her.
Yeah.
We're going to the Clacai conference next
okay.
week, and I'm pretty sure some of them.
Yeah, we'll have a lot of IPAS people there.
Yeah.
I'm monolingual. I don't do anything in Latin America, so unfortunately.
That's only what I do in Latin America. So we work very closely with Leonel videos as well, with all the initiatives that OAS as well.
Okay.
So good partnership.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. We just restructured, and so everybody's trying to find another place. I don't know what our plans for the OAS are going to be, or
1 more minute.
our regional work, but something will happen. We'll see.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure you guys are pretty strong in the region. So.
Yeah, and our particular country offices. I don't know if we'll have I don't know what our role from headquarters will look like, but at least we always have. I think Mexico too is heavily represented at CLECI and the Mexico office. And
Okay, does someone want to share something that you thought or identified? You were talking. Yeah. A freak show. Mm. Others? Yeah.
There's no provision of support for women who opt to continue pregnancy or women who opt to interrupt pregnancy for any reason. There's no solution. It's basically just continuous. Here are the women, here are the pregnancies, here is the waste of the waste of the waste. And we have no solution.
Thank you. Yeah, back there.
They don't say if that affects the quality of life of the kids, what that means for these kids growing up, how they're going to be able to live. So it's just kind of, it sounds like a scare tactic, like your kid looks different. Okay, are these kids going to have to live differently as a result? Like, I don't see any information about what that means for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and granted, this is not like an exhaustive result, just examples of language used in the headlines. One more? Back there. Sorry that I make you run around.
This is a little bit awkward, I'm sorry. You could grab that one, but now I'm over here.
I guess the one, it's the third one from the top. It basically, I think it's a very powerful statement, the last sentence, where it says no woman, he said, should be forced to carry, quote, a child that, in a few words, is useless to society. I think that says a lot about how we value life and who is worthy of living. And then with the sort of in that context of deformity, struggles, it's basically saying, if you're different, do you really have value to society?
Right.
And specifically in this case, people are children who have, and I guess I don't know what the life expectancy is, but people who are born with microcephaly are qualitatively not useful to society.
So this language that has been used, and for most of 2016, since WHO's announcement of Zika as a health crisis, highlights how we learn about disability and what are the conceptualizations that we make through history about disability. And from the disability rights perspective, we talk about 3 specific models to talk about disability or to conceptualize disability that have existed through history. The reason why, and sometimes I ask people, what did you learn when you were a kid about disability? And fear is always up in the list, or I don't want to be like that. That feeling is always kind of present in the way we learned about disability in our lives through media and messaging, and including people who have relatives or family members with a disability in their lives, notice how they are placed in a different position within their families. So one of the models of disability is that we call assistentialist model, and basically is a model that says disability is a curse, is a tragedy. It's a divine intervention that is punishing you for things that you did. And we still hear many women in rural areas, when they have a child with disability, neighbors accusing them of being unfaithful to their husbands, or that they were bad mothers, and that's why they got punished with a child with a disability. So I'm sorry, I see you there. Do you want to say something?
I was just thinking that my name is Sarah Immershine. I'm an abortion provider. The majority of these headlines focus on disabled babies that have been born. They give very little emphasis other than panic to the women who are pregnant with babies that have not been born which may have a disability. And there are, of course, those who believe that every fetus should be brought to its full potential as a child. But that is not unique among cultures or religions in this country. And there are, in this country and around the world, where there are those that think that the mother who carries that pregnancy, especially because it's riskier every day she remains pregnant, should be factored in, and the long-term impact on her life and the rest of her children. There's very little here about the woman, only about the potential child.
And even the quote that is, the increasing cases of microcephaly have given unprecedented urgency to the debate on Latin America, women's rights to access safe abortion and the enforcement of restrictive laws in the region. There's that one you would say, it's, okay, it's advancing women's rights and abortion laws, but then you start digging a little bit, it's like, where does this urgency comes from? Yeah, and it's completely linked to the view that we have of disability. So is that the dichotomy that we create of good abortions and bad abortions. And where really the feminist convergence is abortion should be legal, safe, accessible in all circumstances to all women. And that's the point of convergence. While we get there, these tensions will still remain true. So then the second model that we talk about that got pushed through science after Second World War is the medical model of disability. So disability is the same as your diagnosis. And it's a normalizing model. So basically, you're useful to society as long as you come closer to what's normal. Yeah. So then there's the whole discourse of you can be cured, or how are we gonna fix you? And through this model, the people who have the expert voices are psychiatrists and doctors. So basically not because the healthcare system is not needed, but because those voices replace the voice of people with disabilities themselves. And that's what's problematic, not that they have to interact with the healthcare system. So I don't know if you remember how I'm Colombian, so I have to know about soccer, football, regardless of whether I like it, like it's osmosis. So I don't know if you remember how the World Cup in Brazil opened. Does anybody remember? I don't know if there are soccer fans here. So basically they had this super spectacular child in a wheelchair that was designed for him, the first kick of the ball, to stand up and with the machines, move his feet and kick the ball, the opening ball. And what is the messaging there? Walking is a value. You're a better human being if you walk, right? So then that has a whole other implications. And then the disability rights movement that got much more visible in the 70s and that was pushed by activists in the UK, conceptualized what we now call the social model of disability, which means disability, like gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, is a social construction, like race. And disability results necessarily from the interaction of the functional characteristics of a person and the barriers in society. It's very different to have a disability in the Amazon than having it in Sweden. Because, and the same person with the exact same diagnosis of schizophrenia can become the director of an organization or can live their life tied to a pole in their house. So disability is not the same as a diagnosis. And the medical model equates both. So the question on whether a person has a disability is necessarily a question about that interaction with the environment. And that's how the social model of disability gets now enshrined in international human rights standards. So through the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which is the newest international human rights treaty that was adopted in December of 2006 by the General Assembly. And it specifically it doesn't create rights, it adds a disability rights lens to human rights standards. Prior to that, there had been some statements and important treaties like CEDAW or the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights had like no discrimination provision on sex, religion, or other condition. So disability had been interpreted under the other condition. It was the et cetera of international human rights standards. And that's how it got developed until the convention. So the convention really brings about this perspective of disability as a social construct and as an evolving concept. So it doesn't, if you think of disability as a list of diagnoses, you're standing on the medical model of disability because you're not talking about the interactions, right? And the medical model has been very prevalent in the Zika scare because it's like children with microcephaly X. So it's a broad generalization of what can happen. And what we leave aside is what are the conditions that children that are born with microcephaly need to thrive in society? And what access should the mothers of these children have to services, education, information, et cetera? Article 6, so the convention includes the elimination of stereotypes. So this is a big thing in disability. And one thing that I want to say about stereotyping, disability stereotyping, is that unlike racism or homophobia or transphobia, the driving force behind stereotyping based on disability is not hate, but pity. And in the majority of the cases. And pity is, with racism and also all the years that I've worked on abortion, like you know who the enemy is. Right? Like you're ready to fight. You know who the racist, you know who the homophobe is. With disability, that doesn't happen. Because pity is expressed by all institutions of society, by parents of children who really, really want their children to be well, and by institutions that are doing it for your own good. So I will put you in a mental institution for your own good. And having such a diffused enemy is freaking hard. So then the convention also has a specific article on children. And this year, and I invite you all to read it, the Committee on the Rights of People with Disability issued a general observation on women and girls with disabilities. It's general comment number 3 of August of this year, so it's just right out of the oven. Especially now that the CRPD committee is mostly men. I'm glad it came up before that happened. And then the convention makes explicit mention to the right to maintain fertility as a recognition of the huge history of forced sterilization of people with disabilities that still goes on today, including in the US. And you know that all over the world we use that Buck v. Bell decision of 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. So, and that is, what's interesting is that that decision is used as a disability rights decision, but it has so much of reproductive justice and gender-based violence that it's really, it should be also part of the feminist analysis of how this intersection plays out. In Latin America, all countries have signed the convention, and all but Suriname have ratified it. So this gives us a new challenge because we need to put on equal footing all the existing human rights standards. And I think this is the conversation. So the other issue that arises with this question in Zika, and I think how much I have? So I'll just mention very briefly. The question of selective abortion has been understood, especially sex-selective abortion, has been understood as problematic in human rights terms. But of course, it's a dicey territory because you don't want to create a situation in which women are forbidden to have an abortion based on these reasons. So the reason why human rights bodies have understood it as a problematic practice is because it reinforces stereotypes about women in larger society. And that's how it's been recognized. Now, when it comes to a prenatal diagnosis or disability-based selective abortion, then it's not a practice, it's sanctioned by law in the countries where the fight to legalize abortion has been carved out of what we can. So that is where one of the big nuts is, and that we need to keep having conversations about is, yes, so there's a conversation about what's the standard, and then what's the strategy. Because what happened when the CRPD committee issued recommendations expressing concerns on disability-based selective abortion to Spain, the backlash was absurd. The right wing totally took it on and justified pushing a bill to criminalize abortion based on what the CRPD committee had done, had said. And then this created a whole other divide between the two movements. And it was a mistake for the committee to make those statements, especially under a discrimination clause, because then all feminist groups understood the committee to be attributing personhood to the fetus, and then the right wing saying, see, all abortion laws are eugenic, and you need to criminalize it. So this is messy. I don't know why I like messy situations in my work all the time. But, so we need to be way more, so one level is the standard, and another level is what do we do as advocates and activists as strategy to, and I'll just put, I wanted to show you a lot of stuff. But anyways, the question for me is how can we eliminate ableist stereotypes underneath existing abortion laws? And in the US, it's the Rubiola scare that pushed the legalization of abortion. So it is an ableist and of course, a legacy of eugenics. And I think we need to face that head on as feminists. But it's scary to do so. And how can we make practice of access to abortion less ableist, too, until we reach the point of full decriminalization? And I think that's what Zika is posing us as a question. Is it a setback in the debate on this intersection, or is it an opportunity for true, genuine cross-movement dialogue? Thank you.
Thank you so much for tackling that very tricky topic. So right now we have about 6 minutes for audience questions. If you have any remarks you'd like to make about any of the panelists' discussions from the beginning to now. And there are mics on either end of the auditorium.
Hi there, my name is Leslie Berkstead, and I am a member of the Georgetown Journal of Gender and the Law. I want to thank you all for being here today, and I hate to pivot back to the US election, but unfortunately it's a topic we can't really avoid right now. As leaders and members of organizations that focus not only on the United States, but on countries outside of our own, given that much of the rhetoric and focus of the president-elect has been on reducing the United States' influence and leadership on these issues abroad and just on human rights and civil rights and any sort of development issues abroad. What do you see as a step forward for your organizations? How do you believe this is going to affect you, and how can we support you as you continue to move forward under this new administration?
And anyone who feels able to answer, feel free.
I'll try to, we have a limited time, so just to say, so my other job is U.S. foreign policy, and I started U.S. foreign policy in the Bush era with the global gag rule, and IPAS has been in Washington since then for the past 8 years in fighting a battle to try to get attention to abortion. And we've made tremendous progress over the past 8 years, when previously our colleagues who work on international family planning didn't want to deal with the issue of abortion because it was jeopardizing family planning funds. And we've gone so far that now everybody's talking about the need to fund abortion through U.S. aid until Tuesday, but at least we have support for abortion in that community. So I guess my biggest fear is that we're going to go back to the bad old days where people are throwing abortion under the bus in order to secure international family planning funding. International family planning funding might be on the chopping block no matter what. I don't work in Washington, and I mean, nobody knows what's going to happen. We might even lose USAID. Who knows? But in the event that there's a lot of Republican support for some of the work that global aid is doing, and we just need to make sure that we can't sacrifice abortion for that, because we've gone so far in the past 8 years in Washington, D.C., in highlighting abortion, not only in the U.S. as well. Funding for abortion is important. And everybody, there are going to be people, especially in Congress, ready to just throw abortion under the bus to secure Title X in the domestic context, to secure international family planning funding. And we can't do it because we're just going to be back to where we were before. And that's kind of the most depressing thing. So let's just abortion is one reproductive health issue that women need among others, and let's not leave it out, because there are women who need it, and there are women globally who are going to die if they can't get it, and in the U.S. as well. And so we just need to keep on keeping on and not give up what we need in the women's continuum of care when it comes to reproductive health.
And just to complement on the regional side, on the regional perspective of this, we have had so much support in the last couple of years from this administration on the policies and foreign policies about all these issues. And as you know, the U.S. policies and directions always very well received in Latin America, especially in Central America. We had a lot of support from State Department, some champions at Congress, Norma Torres, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who were very involved in requesting information specifically on El Salvador on these cases, and always State Department issuing all this information under human rights reports, yearly reports. So I think my only concern will be that we will lose this support from the U.S. government. But since we already had such a great and very strong statements in the past, I hope that this will not crack down the rest of the region.
I'll just say that, let's not get thrown under the bus. I mean, in Colombia, that's what exactly happened with the peace accords. They were willing to throw abortion and LGBT people under this bus, and we're now imploding. And I think strategically we need to think about how we join forces. So,
from one somber question to another. My name's Daniela. My question for you all is about patient-doctor confidentiality and what is happening in Central America and Latin America with regards to making changes that will allow women to feel safer when approaching their medical providers about abortion or about their health care without being chained to a bed.
Well, definitely, as you can see with all these cases, specifically in these countries that we're working on, where the complete total abortion, it's a complete ban on abortion, it doesn't exist. So, for example, in El Salvador, there's no confidentiality between the provider and the women. In Honduras, no one even talk about it. We met with the obstetric college in Honduras a couple months ago, and it was a very honest conversation on the fact that we really want to help. We do what we can under the table. Well, we cannot put our lives at risk. We also have families. We also have careers. So we're working towards putting that topic on the conversation. But the reforms are basically just focus on get the exceptions done first. So we bring the topic. We talk to providers. We said that it's a big something that needs to be talked about, but it's very scary. And when you live in a country where you have homicides rates, and you live in like civil war, like in El Salvador and Honduras, it's really a matter of like you want to put your life in risk for this. But it's definitely an issue that we put on the table. We always in our meetings we brought it to the table, and everyone agrees that it's something that needs to be respected and needs to be talked about. But no one wants to allow themselves to extend the possibility of this until all these reforms are done.
Great. We can take, I think, one more question.
Okay. I feel like I'm cheating a little because my question is in two parts. My name is Farah Diaz-Dego, and I am senior counsel for the CL Legal team. And my question is for Alida, mostly. In the beginning of your presentation, you referenced the prosecutions of pregnant people who use drugs. And so the first part of my question is whether you know whether the crimes that they're charged with are the same as or different from the ones that people who are accused of self-inducing abortions are accused of. And then the second part, you mentioned the taboo around substance use being a barrier to being able to do work in this area, and I was wondering if Latin America's position leading the charge for depenalization of drug use and for liberalization of the drug control treaties will change that in the future for your organization. Thank you.
Well, on the second question, let me start with the hardest one. We do not have an expertise on that topic. We know that laws in Latin America are very conservative, and definitely it will be a point that will go against women and against their pregnancy situations. But definitely, I'm not going to be able to talk fondly about that because of the fact that we do not work with these issues. But in the other issues, yes, basically, for example, in the African cases, they were accused of abortion. So it just depends on the country. On the case in Africa, they were accused of abortion. On the case in El Salvador, which was an obstetric emergency, was not a self-induced, they're accused of homicide. So I think it changes from country to country, but I think the message that we should get from all this is that definitely, and we all know that there's a need to break these bans and give more access and give more education. And I think it all starts also with give more access to information to everyone. But for example, and just the last point, if you talk about all these bans and things that can lead you to be persecuted, in Honduras, emergency contraception is legal. So on top of everything, I mean, so there are so many different levels of things that as a woman that lived in danger in a vulnerable group can lead you to be sentenced for something. It's just ridiculous. You have no access to sexual and reproductive health.
Okay, so with that, thank you so much. Alida, Patty, and Andrea, we really appreciate your critical advocacy and your continued work in this area now more so than ever, and for being with us here today. Thank you.
Thank you. I met you in Boston, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it was, I think, adrenaline. I didn't notice. I didn't notice it until. I didn't notice it until you started speaking. I was like, oh, yeah. Yeah, that's right. I did also. That's nice.
All right. I don't actually know how I get things off of the screen.
And then you can put our scene back on. I don't know where that was. There we go. I don't know how to view full screen.
Beautiful. All right. If I can bring folks back for a few more minutes, we have a keynote speech right now that I'm really, really excited about. So, hi everyone, I'm Allie Bohm. I'm one of the co-symposium managing editors for Georgetown Journal on Gender and the Law. First of all, Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks to our incredible speakers and audience members. And I just want to share my thanks with for Courtney and Allison for all of their incredible work on the symposium. A couple of quick housekeeping things before I introduce our keynote. If you are tweeting today, our hashtag is RJ at GJGL, which is Georgetown Journal on Gender and the Law. So please hashtag us. I'm not tweeting, but I hope some of you are. I do want folks to know that this event is being recorded and hopefully webcast, and that we have journalists in the audience. So if you are asking questions, just be aware that what you say is potentially on the record. And with that, so when we set out to organize this conference, we really wanted to bridge theory and practice. And to me, the practice piece feels so much more important this week. And so I'm particularly excited to introduce our keynote speaker who does important work on Capitol Hill day in and day out. Melanie Fontes, sorry, I got so nervous about it and then I screwed it up. Melanie Fontes Reiner is senior counsel for Senator Patty Murray, the ranking member on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and a Democrat from Washington State. As senior counsel, Melanie leads the Senate Democratic Caucus on Women's Health and Rights, Gender-Based Violence, and the Affordable Care Act. In that role, she brings together national partners to build coalitions around policy and legislation. Melanie's entire professional career has been focused on public service. First as an educator, where she witnessed firsthand the importance of access to quality education and healthcare for low-income families. Later, she helped support the launch of the ACA within the administration at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, working with the federal and state governments to provide better, more cost-efficient care for the dually eligible. Recently, in Congress, she was recognized as a top lawyer by the National Law Journal for her work to negotiate a bipartisan human trafficking bill with Republicans that was blocking the confirmation of the incoming Attorney General. Melanie is a graduate of the University of Arizona, where she earned her JD and a degree in business economics. She also earned a master's in education at the City University of New York, Brooklyn College. So they say, those of us in policy say that if you really want to get something done on Capitol Hill, you have to talk to the staff. So we are so excited to have a staff member talking with us today, and I think that she may even take some questions from us, so that's exciting too. Thanks so much for being here.
So I feel like the room emptied out a little bit because a Capitol Hill staffer was going to speak. So just kidding. Hashtag GJL. Thank you all for inviting me to speak here today. Thank you to the Georgetown University Journal of Gender and Law for convening all of us together on this important topic. I think most of us are starting our remarks with a postmortem on the election because it sucks. And, it is what it is, and that's why it's even more important that we're all here talking about this and strategizing and planning and activating, because that literally is going to be the firewall between a constitutional crisis and your rights. And so I wear my nasty woman necklace here today, proudly. So thank you. Let's talk a little bit about women's health. I know we're here to talk about the Hyde Amendment, but I think you have to talk about all of women's health in the Congress to sort of understand the battles that we ensue. So comprehensive access to women's health from birth control to abortion is critical to empowering women. The ability of women to plan and space their pregnancies through access to birth control is linked to greater educational and professional opportunities and increased lifetime earnings. One study concludes that the advent of oral contraceptives contributed to an increase in non-traditional professions for women, including doctors and lawyers. One study where women were able to have an abortion had 6 times higher odds of having positive life plans, most commonly related to education and employment, and more likely to achieve them than women denied an abortion. With this in mind, our Congress founded the ACA. The Affordable Care Act had a very critical amendment, the Women's Health Amendment, which allowed for birth control and other preventative services for women at free, no out-of-pocket cost. It is now the issue of much legal battles in the courts by religious organizations, but it's important. And now to date, 55 million women have benefited from this provision. The goal was to fill in gaps in existing preventative services by expanding access to a broader array of preventative benefits at little or no cost. Congress understood that free preventative services would empower women, decrease maternal mortality, reduce unintended pregnancies and pregnancy-related complications, and also protect children's health and well-being by ensuring that women became pregnant when they wanted to. Congress recognized that women are more likely than men to neglect treatment or care because of cost. And this is especially critical in reproductive health. Access to contraceptive and counseling is a key reform that we're very proud of. Despite these historic gains, as you are shocked, I'm sure, women's health continues to be a political football in the Congress, as anti-choice legislatures in states and here in Washington, D.C., try to roll back these reforms on a daily basis. Birth control is just one part of the puzzle, but it's an important piece, right? Because we can sort of understand how we move the needle forward on abortion, and it also shows how we can sort of try to change the stigma and the discrimination associated with abortion for women. My boss, Senator Patty Murray from Washington State, firmly believes in a woman's constitutionally protected right to control her own body, and that politicians are not doctors and should not interfere with the most personal decision of choosing to have an abortion. She and other champions in the Senate and the House have established a bright line rule around women's health: protect women's access to health care and protect Roe v. Wade. Yet, as you're aware, the threats to women's health are real. Just this 114th Congress, we've had over 114 legislative attacks on a woman's right to choose. These are things from amendments to bills, policy writers buried in bills, bills introduced, bills passed, and will continue to grow, and the threats will continue to happen with the incoming administration and the Republican-led House and Senate. Just yesterday, the Trump-Pence transition agenda posted its health care policies, and the first bullet was on conscious and also protecting life. So it's at the top of the agenda, or whatever you want to call it. So today, to help understand abortion rights, specifically the Hyde Amendment in Congress, I will specifically talk about the changing nature of Hyde in Congress. It's not just Hyde anymore. The politics of Hyde and new threats to women's health, and how we can start to move the needle forward, even in the face of adversity. So most of us understand how many of you know where Hyde came from? Oh, that's pretty good. So most of us know we got it from this man named Henry Hyde. It was an amendment to what at the time was the Department of Health, Education, Labor, and Welfare Appropriations Act of 1977, giving us what is known as the Hyde Amendment. Do all of you know how the appropriations process works? One person? So I kind of know what it works like too, and I work there. But basically, right, there's appropriators and there's authorizers, and the authorizers approve the legislation, that's the committee I work on, and the appropriators then fund bills for discretionary spending for those bills. In determining funding for bills, appropriation writers, it's a writer because it's a policy writer that rides along with the money, allow legislators to caveat their spending. So, the Hyde Amendment attaches to previously authored language and prevents federal spending for that bill from going towards abortion services with limited exceptions. So, this started this precedent, which is not just a precedent now, it's the new normal, of including restrictions in funding bills for Medicaid, Medicare, Children's Health Insurance Program, federal employees and their dependents, Peace Corps volunteers, Native Americans, women in federal prisons and detention centers, including those women who are detained for immigration purposes, women who receive health care from community health centers, and women in the District of Columbia. Yet Hyde is no longer just an appropriation policy writer as it was initially. Hyde is now something, I like to call it the pound of flesh that is required to do any legislating on healthcare. So you call it the give, the pound of flesh, whatever. It is the win that the anti-choice legislators require for anything in healthcare. And so you see Hyde attached to bills that has nothing to do with abortion or access to, it could be like the National Institute of Health, which literally has nothing to do with abortion. They're attaching Hyde to these bills because that's how they sort of rally their base and give the wins. In fact, it's to the point where Hyde is being put on bills that have nothing to do with healthcare. So this past Congress, we saw at least Liz, who works with me, and I went through the last Congress trying to figure out how many different iterations of Hyde there were, and we counted at least 27 different versions of Hyde in the last Congress. So from existing Hyde, which is the Section 506, 507 in the Appropriations Act, which limits the spending and has the exceptions, to things like the Doc Fix bill, where we saw a reference to a reference to a reference. Let's see, bills that attempted to put Hyde on non-government funding. So like if you're a small business owner and you choose to buy your employees health insurance, you're trying to restrict your dollars from going to abortion. Hide on victims' compensation programs. So like if you're a sexual perpetrator and those dollars, when you get convicted, go into a fund for the people you hurt, trying to restrict those dollars. Bills that try to codify Hyde, right? So the appropriations process is not codified. We do it every year. So it's kind of this, even though it's there and it keeps being there, it's kind of a window opportunity that one day we could change it. But we're putting it in bills that aren't that are in underlying statutory text. Bills that don't need Hyde, but include Hyde for the purpose of political purposes, like the Zika bill. I call this fork in the eye Hyde, where there's absolutely no purpose to it, but it's there. State bills that deny abortion providers Medicaid funds or other federal funds for family planning and preventative health, and the various other restrictive measures we've seen on women's health. So it's important to understand the prevalence of Hyde bills and riders and legislation, because it shows this isn't an easy issue for Democrats or Republicans, well, mostly Democrats, but rather something that continues to grow, making the issue even more challenging and important to tackle. Hyde is no longer Hyde. Hyde is rather this chipping away at your right to an abortion and to roll back women's rights. Some of you may recall how the 114th Congress started. We started on a bipartisan trafficking bill called the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act. It was bipartisan. Unbeknownst to some people, it had a rider on the Victims' Compensation Fund, which is unprecedented in Hyde land. We had never, ever allowed that. There's a much bigger pot of money that is Victims' Compensation Fund that goes to all the states, and that if we'd allowed one use of this way, would sort of change the rules of the road for this other big pot of money. And so it was this huge fight. It was a nasty fight, and we were stuck on it for 7 weeks with 5 failed cloture votes. And so, we were able to compromise with our counterparts across the aisle and come up with a solution and move the bill forward. But it really put a microscope on this issue and abortion politics in the Congress. And in fact, as she said earlier, it ended up holding up Loretta Lynch. It was just this whole thing that I think sort of hit the Congress head on this issue. So that was one instance in where we won. So this, unfortunately, this isn't going to get any easier with the Republican-led House and Senate and President. In the 114th Congress, Senate Democrats with a Democratic president were this firewall and this safety valve on efforts to roll back Roe, on efforts to defund Planned Parenthood. And yes, all of our bosses are still going to be there and going to be fighting, but we lost the other firewall that we had, which is a veto. So it's a little bit harder. But, we were able to defeat the 20-week abortion ban, several attempts to defund Planned Parenthood, various attempts to roll back reforms made under the Affordable Care. I mean, these are things that don't get reported in the news that often, but these people, my boss, Barbara, all these other members, they are working daily to protect these rights, and they are preventing them from happening in the Senate, which is something that doesn't happen in the House. And so the Senate becomes really, really important over the next 4 years. So where to go with the new administration becomes harder, much harder. While we're not exactly sure what Donald Trump's policies are, he was pro-choice, and then he wanted to punish all women that had abortions. That is not, I just don't know where this sort of fits on his list of things to do. But I think it's very clear where his running mate and Vice President-elect Mike Pence stands on women's health. So, he was the original creator of the Defund Planned Parenthood movement in the Congress, signed a bill into law requiring burial or cremation for aborted fetuses, said he would like to send Roe to the ash heap of history, and slashed Planned Parenthood funding in his home state of Indiana, arguably leading to one of the county's HIV outbreak. So his agenda is very, very clear, and this will make fighting for abortion restrictions and Hyde even harder in this upcoming session. This makes Senate Democrats' firewall even more critical in the fight against expanding Hyde and abortion restrictions. So we will continue to filibuster bills and keep them procedurally from moving forward to the extent that's possible. But this is a tricky narrative, right? Democrats uphold the bright line of protecting Roe and keeping new restrictions from being put into law, still trying to govern and ensure that, important must-pass legislation continues to move forward. So it's a fine line that these members have to walk, but they've walked it before and they'll continue to walk it. So moving forward from Hyde, everyone looks sad, so I think it's really positive that we're here together. I'd like to reiterate that. Now that we have, so we have polls out there that help us, right? NARAL Pro-Choice America says 7 out of 10 Americans support legal abortion. That's not nothing. And then All Above All has done a lot of polling around abortion restrictions, and they found that 3 out of 4 voters found that despite their views on abortion, politicians should not be able to deny a woman's health care coverage because she is poor. So this is all good news in the movement to increase access to abortion and the attention to the issue. I think we can learn a lot from the LGBT groups and their community and their movement to combat discriminatory legislation, garner support garner support for the community. This movement has started grassroots levels in states, pushing proactive legislation, building coalitions with the business community to combat bad legislation like the state RFRAs. My own home state of Arizona, where I'm from, it was very impressive to me to see that happen, but the business coalitions partnered with the LGBT groups and they defeated a similar law to Indiana. In Arizona, that's not bad. So this local approach has impacted the Congress and made it much harder for anti-LGBT politicians to push their agenda at the federal level. It's the coalition building in states that builds a safety net for when there are federal threats to LGBT rights that helps protect them nationally. I think we can also learn a lot from our own communities in the birth control movement, where we have seen state coalitions and proactive legislation on both sides of the aisle. They helped destigmatize access to birth control and helped advance the benefit for women with a movement of over-the-counter birth control, longer prescriptions, readily more accessible access to birth control in the states. And I think that as you see in all of these bad things happening in the Congress, we haven't really seen as much on birth control because they don't want to take the votes on it. Because it's bad for them. So, in addition, I think there's some opportunities in the interim to try to make Hyde better. Right now, as we know, most iterations of Hyde in the appropriations bill include the rape, life of women, and incest exceptions, but that's not across the country, sadly. And so 32 states and District of Columbia follow the sort of federal exception standard, providing the exceptions. 3 of these states provide state funds for abortion in cases of fetal impairment, so that's better in addition to. 3 states provide funds for abortion that are necessary to prevent grave, long-lasting damage to a woman's physical health, so that's in addition to. 1 state, South Dakota, provides abortions only in the case of the life endangerment of the woman. There's no rape or incest exception. So 17 states have a policy that direct Medicaid to pay for all or most medically necessary abortions. 4 of these states provide such funds voluntarily, including the state my boss is from, Washington State. And 13 states do so under court order. So restricting funding for abortion obviously creates barriers for low-income women. Oftentimes these women cannot afford the procedure. She may have to raise funds on her own, which takes longer time, which then means it's a more complicated procedure and potentially more costly. Coupled with restrictive state abortion laws, which thanks to Whole Woman v. Hellerstedt, thank you to all of you that worked on that, they're starting to fall, but they still exist, right? We have waiting periods, we have other things in place, and so maybe she raises the money, but she also has to find childcare and take a day off of work. And these are low-income women, primarily, who can't afford to just go to their local hospital or somewhere else to get an abortion. And so they have to travel very far to find the nearest Planned Parenthood or family planning clinic to help them. So one potential path could be pushing more states at local level to cover abortion care under Medicaid, right? Just like the LGBT community, I think that could be one pathway. Another potential pathway could try to make the states that don't follow the exceptions, like South Dakota, or require court orders to do better through local action or federal oversight. So, Trump. While the road ahead is rife with threats to women's health, abortion access, we will continue to fight, and you can count on that. It is important that we not lose sight of the importance of reproductive freedom for women to economic empowerment and raising up our working families. The Senate will continue to press against efforts to roll back women's rights and fight for women's health. So thank you. At this time, if you have questions that are answerable, I will answer them.
And if you have questions, please line up at the microphones to ask them.
I always have questions. As you mentioned, 4 states proactively include abortion services in Medicaid, and it includes Washington State, also Maryland. But in Maryland, we have to still give a mental health explanation or excuse. We have to certify that the patient's mental health will suffer if she doesn't have access to abortion. Is this similar in all the 17 states or the 4 states, California, New York?
So I'm not sure. I know in Washington that is not a thing that happens, and I doubt that that happens in California, but I'm not 100% sure. The Guttmacher Institute has a report on the different states, but I think in the 4, it's pretty clear that there's not the sort of additional barriers.
Hello, I'm Christine Grimaldi from Rewire. I wrote a story yesterday. Yes, formerly RH Reality Check. I wrote a story yesterday. I was trying to ascertain some of the initial steps that Democrats may be taking. It was really hard the day after the election for multiple reasons. And one of them was that...
Because you were crying?
I cried many times. I can say that objectively as a journalist, that I'm terrified at what is to come, but that we have important work to do. So, as I was calling different congressional offices and, interviews I had scheduled started to cancel, I was trying to figure out, okay, like, where do we go from here? And luckily I was able to talk to a few aides on the House and the Senate side, and they said, luckily we have elected 3 women of color to the Senate, and the reproductive justice movement, historically rests on their shoulders, and we hope that they will help be that blockade like you were talking about in the Senate. And in the House, they've elected women like Stephanie Murphy down in Florida, and again, like, you've elected folks that are more progressive, more pro-choice, and that won't stand for this. So I just wanted to talk about whether, now that it's been 2 more days since, some of these initial phone calls, what sorts of conversations are going on right now about what's to happen in the 115th Congress, how, Democrats are going to work together and try to stop, these anti-choice attacks that we anticipate.
Sure. I mean, I think obviously people are still trying to figure out what the path forward is, but I think on this issue, people keep telling me, you just have to stay in there and fight. And it's like, yeah, I get that, but we fight all the time on this issue, right? That's not new. So I don't know that the playbook is that different here legislatively, right? Like, I think we saw a 20-week abortion ban in both the House and the Senate last year, and I would be shocked if they didn't do that again. But I think the real question is what happens in the sort of regulatory, sub-regulatory policies, and I think there are smarter than me people that are sifting through that right now and trying to figure out what can we protect, and sort of where they're going to target. And honestly, I just don't know. I think the Obamacare stuff is very out there, and that looks like that's going to happen. And so it's not clear to me where this sort of lays in sort of the top whatever 100 or however many number of things they're ordering. But I mean, I don't think the playbook changes really much for us, right? Like, we know who our champions are. I think we're getting some real bright stars from our women that were elected to come to the Congress, and so that's also helpful to help, be the voice and to be sort of, active. Thanks.
I'm Professor Michelle Goodwin from the University of California, Irvine. And, one of the things that we've paid much less attention to has been the agency appointments that will come about. Of course, there's the cabinet. There's been lots of anticipation about that, and there's been lots of anticipation about what's going to happen with the court, particularly given that there is an existing vacancy and the potential that there could be as many as 3 others, given the age of individuals on the court. But the agencies will matter just as much when you think about the volume of those who will be appointed. And when you think through a reproductive justice lens, then it's many different aspects of life that will be impacted. We're talking about the FDA, we're talking about the EOC, we're talking about the Food and Drug Administration, right? And we know that through the Bush administration, the suppression of Plan B coming to the market, which was deeply politicized, and a great opinion that was written highlighting that. So just as a message more than a question for us all to be thinking about those issues, and also to be thinking about those issues creatively, because there is so much mourning now. But I think if anything, in a lot of ways we've been here before, right? We could call this Jim Crow 2.0. We really could. And to the extent that we care about and think about reproductive justice, then let's not forget that there are women of color who fought back, battled back, and who actually made our Constitution come far more alive than our founders ever did. You know, when we enacted the Constitution that gave people the right to vote, it wasn't real until the 1965 Civil Rights Act, where then truly everybody had the right to vote in this country, and that wasn't old white men. So as painful as this reality may seem right now, we also have to call upon people who had far much less than we did, far less privilege than we did, who brought the system down and actually lifted it up in the process.
Yeah, I mean, I think advocates and think tanks and others are doing the same thing you are doing and trying to figure out what those smaller agencies like CDC and other really critical agencies to preventative public health, including women's health, or what that's going to look like. And I just don't think we know at this point, right? But I agree with you. We can do a lot. Great. Well, thanks so much, everybody.